Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video it is something different because I'll be talking about this lens right here. It's the Viltrox 56mm 1.4. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Viltrox 56 1.4. I have to tell you that I actually took quite some time to debate and decide on this lens at the end, simply because I actually wanted the Fuji from the very beginning, and also the fact that the Fuji glass is much sharper than this glass. Well, not much sharper. If you're only posting on Instagram, you will not really see that much of a difference, but if you're just working behind the monitor, that difference is there from what I can see. And also the contrast control, the color fringing, the vignetting and everything, it's just so much better control and also so much more pleasing on the Fuji. Again, if you're just posting on Instagram, things like that, these things you don't really see that much, and also they're easily fixable, but just straight out of the camera it's just more pleasant on the Fuji from my experience. And also on the other hand, it's just a much better control ring over here, well, aperture ring. Here it's clickless, and on the Fuji it's actually a physical click. Of course, if you're on the Sony side of things, I know that the Viltrox stepless aperture ring here actually works really nicely and smoothly, but on the Fuji, at least on my X-T2, X-T3, X-T20, X-T1, and a few other Fuji X-Ts I have, not the latest one, I don't have the X-Pro 3 or nor the X-T4, so I cannot really confirm with those cameras, but as of other Fuji cameras that I have, whenever you change the aperture, especially during filming, that flickering effect is still present. So it's not really as smooth as one would hope it to be. So for me, it would still be nice to have that click aperture, because then at least I don't need to always look at the lens if I accidentally bumped the aperture, or if I want to change the aperture, I don't need to look where I am or even behind the screen, because if it's like a real physical click, then I can just count in my head or just have an approximate guesstimate in my head of where certain aperture that I want to be, maybe. And yeah, that's about it. And what really got me on deciding on this lens is actually the price range. It is so much cheaper, and for those of you who follow my channel for a long time will know that I don't use Fuji too often with my all of my work. I do use Fuji regularly, but my main system is still my Canon, and for professional work and everything, I do have an 85 1.2 on my Canon side of things. So on that note, it's kind of like, yeah, do I really want to spend that much? I love the image quality, the build quality, usability, everything more from the Fuji lens, but then does the price really justify enjoying using those and also liking the image quality more when I'm gonna be mostly, if not all the time, posting the images coming out of this lens either on YouTube or on Facebook or on Instagram? It's just, it doesn't really make that much sense unless I would have a lot of money, which I don't, for to spend on gear that I don't really make profit that much off anyway, because my Fuji is just purely for street photography, travel photography, snapshots, things like that. I do post a lot, and I do well, with Fuji cameras I do post a lot of social media posts, and I also actually work with Fuji quite a bit, just in terms of work and making money. I still trust my Canon more than my Fuji, because my Fuji at least failed before, and my Canon actually never failed before, and also the full frame sensor and the Canon color science is still better for me to use. So yeah, that's just, though it's a really subjective thing, that's why I went for this lens than going for the Fuji one. So in this video, I would like to talk about the usability, the image quality side of things, and yeah, it's gonna be a short video, hopefully, because this is just coming from my opinion and what I think based on how I use it, because from what I've seen on the internet is that different people will definitely have different opinions about this lens, and they're all very, very different. So yeah, let's get into the video. After a while already. So the usability of this lens, as I mentioned earlier, the ring here is a stepless ring, unless if you go to the auto at 16, and if you switch to auto, there's a slight click for you to know, but otherwise the ring is stiff, so you're not going to be like slipping it through by accident that easily, but there is still a chance because of it being stepless ring. And the control ring is really nicely buttery smooth, which is what I really like, but Fuji manual focus is still not really there compared to the competition of Canon, Nikon, and Sony, so I wouldn't really manual focus that much with Fuji cameras anyway. The hood itself is really big though, and it's metal. It's actually really nicely built, though I do prefer like plastic lens hood because they protect your lens better, because I have a tendency to actually drop my lens quite a few times when I'm actually working in the field, because I care about getting the footage more than the actual carrying of my equipment. So in my experience, metal lens hood, if the lens drop from a really high point of view, it will break the lens more. But aesthetically, this metal lens hood is much better than the plastic lens hood, of course, but that's a subjective thing to have. Otherwise, the lens is actually really small, nice and light, really slim with a metal mount, and I already updated to the latest firmware, so there is that. The focusing speed on this is actually pretty fast. I was really surprised. At first I was really skeptical of like, will it be fast or will it not be fast? But it is faster than some of my lenses like the 60mm Fuji, and it is more accurate than that lens. But if I were to compare it to like this lens right here, the 16mm 1.4, this is my favorite Fuji lens by far, and it focuses so fast and it's so sharp at most aperture. And none of the lenses that I have in the Fuji line of things, as well as other lenses for my Fuji system, can actually beat this lens as of now. So there's that. But otherwise, it is a really nice light form factor and really easy to operate lens. So on that, it's a plus. Onto the image quality side of things, here is where it gets a little tricky, because different reviews on the internet gave different thoughts, and I think mine will also be somewhat different, but also somewhat of like a mixed bag between certain other reviews, what I agree with them and everything. Like, some people say the image quality is good. Now here's the thing with me, like, I kind of agree but also disagree with that. If the lighting is not harsh, then the image quality is good, I would say. But if the lighting is harsh, like there's a lot of backlight, or there's a lot of silhouettes, or there's a lot of like artificial light source, this lens will not be able to handle it. And if there's a lot of contrast in the scene, this lens, at least in my opinion and also my standards, it just doesn't handle it well. But if you're just taking simple portraits in like normal lighting, and also, or it doesn't have to be portrait, it can be landscape. For example, in a normal lighting where it's not harsh and there's not a lot of contrast, then this lens will handle it fine. When you add it, it's fine. But once you introduce really high contrast scenes to it, and also a lot of different kind of difficult lighting, more complex lighting into the scene, this is where this lens gets a little bit tricky, because first of all, it could introduce you to flaring, and the flaring on this lens is atrocious in my opinion. Yeah, that's really the only thing I can say about it, because at best is horrible, the flaring control on this particular lens. And though you cannot really fix the flaring that much, the color fringing is also introduced. But with the color fringing, you can still fix that in like Lightroom and in other editing softwares that you may have. So there's that, but the flaring part is just really distracting. It kind of reminds me of like the kit lens 16 to 50mm lens. That lens also produces really bad flaring. But if you can cope with that type of flaring, and if you don't mind, or if you don't shoot in a lot of like backlit scenarios, or a lot of scenarios where you're shooting directly into the sunlight or the light source itself, then this lens will be fine. Because once you introduce even other light source into the lens, the contrast in the image quality within this lens just decrease dramatically. And I mean, I was expecting this, but just not as bad. And of course, if you're always used to the budget lenses from Fuji and everything, then you know, what I'm saying right now might seem too harsh on the lens, but if you're coming from like a really higher up lenses from Fuji, like the 16 1.4, or even from other system, like if you're coming from Canon and you've been using a lot of L series lenses, then you know, obviously this lens is nothing compared to those lenses, and it's not fair comparing it to. But you will have your own standards, and in that particular standards, even if you lower your standards, the image quality with the flaring is still bad. I have nothing against flaring when it's natural, but this lens flaring is particularly bad in my opinion. It doesn't look natural, and the color, the purplish, magenta-ish color of flaring that this lens produces is just not really pleasing to the eye, and how much it spreads out in that glass as well. There's that. But obviously the good side is, as I mentioned earlier, if everything is fine, then the actual image quality is pretty good. And if you bring it in post, like Lightroom, Photoshop, what have you, you can really bring the image to life. Now that is only with the case if the lighting is good. But that's with the photography side of things. In terms of video side of things, I haven't really tested in a real professional shoot yet with this particular lens, but just like filming stuff for like just simple Instagram stories or anything like that, it's fine. But like if you start editing in post, and here's what I can also like see in post is the image quality of the video like coming out of this lens is better than the photography side of things, simply because video is still lower resolution, so the flaw of the lens isn't really magnified that much. So yeah, in that sense, it's a very good lens to have for video. And also the softness effects and the decrease in contrast when filming with harsh light, that is where this lens sometimes can work to your advantage, because if you like certain vintage look to the lens or certain kind of cinematic look to the lens with certain softness sometimes when you're filming harsh light, then you know this lens can really give you that advantage. And yeah, it's a really pleasant lens to work with. But if you want everything to be like super perfect and super sharp and super contrasty like many other lenses, and very minimal amount of color fringing when doing even video work, then this lens might not be for you. But if you're willing to cope with certain setback of the color fringing that you might see in certain harsh lighting condition or situations where there's really high and harsh contrast, then you know, take it for what it's worth, really. Otherwise, yeah, that's it really about this lens. So I would really recommend this lens if you're starting out, and also if you're looking for a lens that like to see if this focal length is really right for you, whether if you're a professional or if you're a beginner, because you know, working with different focal length is also a different learning curve and also a different perspective you have to take into consideration. Because for example, before getting the 16mm that I have on this particular camera, the X-T3, I was so used to the 16 to 35mm lens, and I always shoot at 16, but then I learned to shoot at 16mm. That's kind of like a 24mm field of view if you compare to the full frame field of view. So I learned to have my perspective at that particular focal length, so it really changed the way I shoot so much. So if you just want to really get into the field and wanting to learn into the perspective of 56mm, then this lens is also a nice stepping up to that. Otherwise, you can always go to the 50mm from Fuji, which is a lower budget one, and well, obviously depending on where you live, the price range really differs. And also, like, if you really want to pull the trigger, then you can just go with the 56 1.2 from Fuji. Yeah. Otherwise, for 250 euros, you cannot really go wrong, and you cannot really complain a lot. If you lost the lens, like lose the lens one day, or if the lens breaks one day, then you know, it's not as expensive as the Fuji one to replace. So yeah, there's that. I know it's a weird video because usually I would have tons and tons of things to say about a lens in my normal lens video, what I think about it and everything, but this is just kind of like, to me, a lens of mixed bag, because the image quality is not that bad, but also not that good depending on which standards you give. If you're just stepping up to it, it is good. If you're coming from like a higher class lenses, it's not really that good. But in the same time, it is also really, really cheap at a really bright aperture. The autofocusing system is almost silent and not slow, but also not the fastest lens in the world. It will get a lot of action accurately focused, but not all action scenarios, because obviously Fuji's system is also not that accurate when it comes to focusing anyway. But yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say. But yeah, if you're looking for a free photography guidebook, it's linked down in the description below. It's totally for free, it's on my website, and you don't need to send me your email address or anything. Same thing with my free 2021 calendar, it's also there. And I'll leave it here. Thank you very much for watching, and have fun shooting. Bye!